I'm best known with my wife as the author of a diet book, Perfect Health Diet. And now there's an embarrassing fact for diet book authors that if you look at epidemiological evidence, so with populations, and try to see if diet has a big influence on health, it's actually somewhat difficult to tease out evidence that any particular diet is very good. And the reason for that is really that diet is so important for health that our brain has evolved strong regulatory tendencies to drive people toward a healthy diet. And with the result that people all around the world eat very similar diets. And so if you do epidemiology, there's very little variation. So what we find in the diet world is that you'll see people in one part of the world will eat rice and people in another part will eat wheat, but the amount of starch that they eat is very similar. And so we see variations in diet based on income and food availability. So poor people will eat a different diet with less animal food and more cereal grains. And poor people have worse health. But it's very difficult to tell exactly what dietary factor is causing differences in health and how important diet is. But one thing we can look around the world and see epidemiologically is that lifestyle is very important, and especially circadian rhythms are very important. And so one thing that shows up very clearly is that anytime you have disrupted circadian rhythms, your health gets much worse. So people who have to work night shifts, who have sleep apnea, or who don't do any of the other circadian rhythm and training lifestyle effects tend to have much shorter lifespans. And the reason lifestyle shows up very strongly is that in our ancestral environment, in the Paleolithic, you had no choice about what lifestyle you had to live. The lights would always come on when the sun came up. The temperature would always be warmer in the daytime than at night. You always had to go out and get some exercise in order to obtain your food. So we didn't have the same regulatory influences develop in our brains in regard to lifestyle as we did for diet. All right, so there's a lot more variability in lifestyle, and we can see big effects epidemiologically in the different lifestyles people live. And so I'm often asked by people concerned about longevity, for instance, how do you explain the blue zones? So these people have gone around and looked for long-lived cultures in the world, and they often find the longest-lived peoples are in small islands, like in the Aegean or Okinawa or something. And so why did they live a long time? Often on these islands, it didn't make sense to build electrical power plants and highways and so on, and so they adopted modern lifestyles later. But they were often still in Europe or Japan or places where they were relatively well off and had access to good food. And so, although there are some dietary correlations, I think it's the lifestyle which shows up quite strongly. And our concern was really to, try to help people become healthy. I got into health not as a profession, but to try to make my own health as best as possible. And, so I've been interested in lifestyle quite a while and researching it. And I discovered the common element that circadian rhythms are a common explanation for all of the lifestyle factors which have a big impact on our health. And so in this talk, I want to explain why circadian rhythms are so important, why they're a unifying factor in health, and then talk at the end about what are the practical steps we can do in order to live a very healthy life. So let's see. All right. Okay, so it's quite clear that circadian rhythms are very important for health. As I'll talk about in a moment, there are a number of Zeitgebers, a number of different factors that influence circadian rhythms. And if you're missing any one of them, then you'll typically lose up to 6 years of life expectancy.